Buenas tardes.
So, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to Fundación Telefónica. My name is Javier Gutiérrez-Bolívar. I'm in charge of innovation and strategy of Fundación Telefónica. Today I have the pleasure of introducing the third meeting of this year of one of the cycles, the most emblematic cycles of our schedule, Tech and Society. These meetings are thanks to a close relationship between Aspen Institute Spain and Fundación Telefónica that has been developed since 2017, 8 years ago, thanks to José María de Areilza as Secretary General of Aspen and the whole Aspen team for the great work throughout these years. For the ones of you that don't know this program, it aims at promoting reflection about the great challenges of technology for our society. In this 9th edition, we will focus on a transversal topic. This is the responsibility of current society towards new generations. In this sense, we meet in order to analyze one of the most decisive aspects of our current days: international competition for the future of AI. A technology, the development and regulation of which is becoming into strategic global arena. And there's a great rivalry between two important countries like the US and China. In this complex scenario, Europe wants to assume an accountable and active role, being a role model in competitiveness and innovation, and guaranteeing the protection of every people and ethics.
Desde Fundación Telefónica, al igual que desde Telefónica.
So from Telefónica and from Fundación Telefónica, we are aware that we have to contribute to lead this discussion, and we aspire to become into a role model in promoting strategies that foster technology competitiveness and contribute to an ethical and transparent development of technology with a social impact. With this, I give the floor to José María de Areilza so that he can introduce our guest, David Rennie. He's the editor of Geopolítica and The Economist. Thank you very much, David, for being with us today and for holding this discussion with us. Thank you.
Buenas tardes.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your words, Javier. It's a great pleasure to open the season with this discussion with Fundación Telefónica. In Aspen Institute, we like to say that questions are much more important than answers, because answers are temporary and questions are permanent. I think that in this moment, with these blocks between China, US and Europe, among all of them, we will have questions, but questions are paramount because they have to do with our civilization, with common good, with the type of society that we want to give to our new generations. And I'm very happy to have David Rennie with us. He will help us shed light on all these topics.
David is a leading international relations writer. He's lived for the last 10 years in China as bureau chief of The Economist. He's been now a year back in Europe as geopolitics editor of The Economist. Before that, he was also bureau chief in Washington and also Brussels correspondent. So he's really been there. He's talked to everyone. He still conducts many interviews and trips to really have a very good feel of what's going on in the minds of leaders, of top experts, and he has an amazing way to explain very complex problems to a very enlightened audience like this one. He's taken the time to spend a couple of days in Madrid with us. I know how busy he is, so thank you so much, David. I've asked him to share some remarks, and then we'll have a conversation and we'll open it to the public. Thank you, Fundación Telefónica, and thank you all. David.
Muchas gracias, José María. Y discúlpenme por el...
Excuse me for speaking English, I'm trying to protect your wonderful language.
The Spanish language. So, I'm not a technological journalist, I'm a political journalist. I've spent the last 27 years living around the world, twice in Beijing, twice in Washington. And so my focus is on not who is going to win the technology contest of AI, but the second contest that is also very clearly underway, which is who gets to govern AI, who gets to set the rules, the laws, but also the fundamental moral norms and values. And this is a competition that involves the US and China, but also the European Union, the three giant economic and regulatory blocks of the 21st century. And to make it even more complicated, there is no agreement about what the contest of AI technology even is. And so as a provocation, I'm going to sum it up as three different things. There is a vision that the AI contest is a race between America and China that is something like the race to split the atom, to be the first power to have the doomsday control that comes with having a nuclear bomb back in the Second World War. There's a second view that AI will be something like the internet, but a kind of turbocharged version of the internet. And then there's a third view that AI is a general technology of staggering broad importance, like electricity, like the revolution when electricity changed industry forever. And these have very powerful political and ideological implications, whether it's the atom bomb, the internet, or electricity. And I think, to simplify, there are many people in the Trump administration and tech companies at the top of American tech aligned with the Trump administration who clearly see that the AI race with China is like the race for the atom bomb. We can see this. So, in fact, the Select Committee on China in the US House of Representatives has talked about the need to have a Manhattan Project to get to artificial general intelligence. That's the sort of jargon for the kind of AI that is more capable than human intelligence. And there is this strong belief among some of the top AI bosses that just like America was uniquely powerful when it was the only country in the world with the atom bomb, that if America can get AGI first, it will hold a technology that changes everything. We have seen J.D. Vance, the vice president, a very powerful ideological figure in this administration, also close to the Silicon Valley tech world, saying the United States must win this race with China, or the world will be enslaved by an AI designed by communist China. And to be slightly less bleak and dramatic, I think the most positive way of viewing how the Americans are approaching this race for this super intelligence, this super AI intelligence, is a bit like the offer that President Eisenhower made to the world in 1953 with the Atoms for Peace program. He understood the world was frightened of America's nuclear power, and so he offered a deal to dozens of countries. If you accept American technology, American scientific training, American enriched uranium and fuel and a research reactor, you can have a peaceful civilian nuclear program. In exchange, America gets complete oversight of your nuclear work. America knows whether you're building a bomb or whether you're keeping to the rules. In fact, this is the origin, ironically, of the Iranian nuclear program to this day. It came from that Atoms for Peace program. But what's the AI comparison? So someone like Vice President Vance has said several times in public that America's dominance gives it control over the chips, over the designs, over the models, over the algorithms. It controls more than half of global investment in AI, and that is a deliberate strategy. With that full control of the AI stack, America can offer this to the world, but in exchange the world will have to follow American values and American ideology, and they're willing to enforce this with strict threats of tariffs, strict threats of taking action against any country that tries to regulate American technology. So this is a full American stack, this atom bomb model, with ideology embedded up in it. This is extremely difficult for the European Union because the Trump administration has a unique dislike of Europe. One of the surprises for me, based in when I go to Washington, is that there is almost more resentment and dislike, antipathy towards Europe than there is towards China or Iran. And I think that Europe has been caught up in the American partisan culture wars, that Europe, to simplify, is now coded as a kind of giant continent of Democrats, that Europe's immigration policies, Europe's views of free speech, of disinformation, that these effectively make Europe a giant woke continent. And that enrages people like President Vance. So we saw him at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year saying that Europe's controls on things like hate speech or disinformation, its desire to control what Google or Meta or Twitter, X, puts in front of European eyeballs, that is a worse threat than the threat of Russia, that Europe has lost its way as a democratic power. And so we saw him, J.D. Vance, at an AI conference in Paris in February, saying that the US possesses the full AI stack, and we are going to not accept foreign governments that wish to control how that stack works in US tech companies. And he said, we are in America preparing an AI action plan that directly challenges precautionary regulation. Now that sounds like a very boring phrase, but it's incredibly important. There are two completely different visions of how you regulate the world. There's the American vision, which is you should allow government companies to do as much as possible, and if there's problems, they can sue that company in court. The litigation, risk-based regulation model. And then there's the European precautionary model, which says if we don't know whether a technology is 100% safe, then we should assume that it's not safe. We should take a precautionary view, that the balance of concern is, to regulate something that might be dangerous. America absolutely rejects that principle, and it is willing to use tough measures. So Donald Trump, about 2 weeks ago, sent out a social media statement saying, I put all countries on notice that if they seek to impose rules or legislation on American tech companies, they will face substantial additional tariffs. And we see America boasting in public, not just at Europe but also at China, that their control of the technology gives them the ability to hold back countries like China. A remarkable man, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, who has gone out on television and said things that it's not clear why he says them in public, but he boasted recently that the trick with China is, he said, we don't sell them our best chips, not even our second best stuff, not even our third best. The fourth one down, that's what we want China to keep using. We want them to be addicted to American technology. That's the plan. It reminds me a bit of those, I love the old James Bond films with Sean Connery, where the villain has him sort of tied to a table, and because he's about to die, the villain tells him his entire plan for world domination. But then obviously in the Bond films, it's a smidgen too soon, because then Bond is off the table and the volcano is blowing up. So I think that the Trump administration boasting to China that it has a plan to completely stop China developing AI is a kind of Bond villain moment. And we see China responding, very insulted, saying, as a result, we will not buy the chips that NVIDIA is offering us. They're clearly dangerous. There's clearly a trap in there. So the American model, that atom bomb model, is clearly very alarming to Europe. It comes with threats attached. It comes with ideological values embedded in the technology. And it's also clearly, directly, openly, publicly designed to hold China back. It's a winner-takes-all race that America wants to win and it wants China to lose. So that model of governance clearly has some big obstacles. Then the internet model. This is very comforting if you're Europe or America, because if China's model of governing AI is the same as China's model for governing the internet, we know that that involves tremendous state control, it involves censorship, it involves building the great firewall of China to block huge numbers of websites, including The Economist, I'm proud to say, is blocked in China. And that this is only of attraction to a number of autocratic countries, that democracies will not tolerate that degree of censorship and control. The Chinese internet is basically walled off behind this high wall of digital controls. And it is true that the early governance of AI in China looks a lot like China's governance of the internet. So we saw very early on, 2023, China banned the most effective American chatbots, ChatGPT. About 100 generative AI chatbots have been banned by China. A particular focus, as you would expect, from a communist party that is extremely concerned to control information and what their people see. They're very, very focused on things like the apps that recommend content. That, you know, the TikTok type apps that know what you're interested in, and so if you watch a cat video, you get more cat videos, or if you watch something about Tibet, you get more about Tibet. Recommendation apps are now subject in China to a licensing law that you have to submit as a company your algorithm to the Chinese Cyber Administration. They get to review it for security. It has to be registered. They have to see the algorithm. So that looks like a fairly unappealing model. And there are some extraordinary examples. There's a very good NGO called the China Media Project, which follows Chinese censorship. They found an example. Someone leaked to them the tests that a Chinese toy company had subjected to an AI toy. It's a little cat called the Talking Tom AI Companion. So your child has this little toy cat that can speak to them because it's got a chatbot embedded in it. And they got the leaked test results from the Chinese toy company, where some employee of the toy company had to ask the little cat questions about Xi Jinping, is he a good man? Who owns Taiwan? Who owns Tibet? And the cat says things like, Tibet has been an inalienable part of Chinese territory since ancient times, which, so it meant the cat passed. China is very interested in the propaganda possibilities of AI. So China Central Television, the main state broadcaster, in June aired an AI-generated segment showing Chinese soldiers from World War II traveling through time to modern China and then meeting modern Chinese who explain that China is now strong and powerful and foreigners can no longer bully China, and the World War II soldiers are very proud. They're very excited by the prospect of translating Chinese propaganda into Spanish, into English, into every other language to generate more propaganda. In international forums on the internet, China has for many years joined with countries like Russia, some of the Arab countries from the Arab Gulf, in pushing a model of the internet that is absolutely about control by sovereign governments. So if you're Europe, or if you're America, and you believe that that internet model is China's choice, then you could feel somewhat relaxed, because that's only likely to appeal to countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia, but it's not going to appeal to many democracies. But China thinks that that internet model is only part of the story, that that is the part that controls political content, that what the members of the public see. But for the AI applications that run factories or that run, traffic lights, sewage systems, that is like electricity. And that America is actually wrong to think of this as a race for the atom bomb, that actually China is content to be in second place. It isn't spending hundreds of billions of dollars trying to build out these incredibly high performance models like ChatGPT and the other models that we see getting so much money in America. That basically being good enough, being a close second, but then spreading your technology incredibly widely and incredibly rapidly is the way to become dominant in AI governance. And so, because they're not going to compete with America, because they can't, because they're not getting the chips they need to compete with the very most high performance models and apps and algorithms in America, they're trying to create a rival model of cheap, interchangeable AI that is essentially a commodity. It's a utility like electricity. And this is a model that they think will have tremendous appeal. And they are very, very serious about spreading it incredibly fast in China. So last week, the State Council in China, which is like their cabinet of ministers, issued a series of guidelines on what they call the AI Plus initiative. And they said by 2027, so very, very soon, AI needs to become a sort of daily reality of life in key sectors. So AI assistants, AI agents, AI terminals and devices essentially will become as common as a smartphone within the next 2 or 3 years. And they're talking about a revolutionary leap in productivity, new forms of intelligence society, I'm quoting here the Chinese document, characterized by human-machine collaboration. And these areas are science and technology, industrial development, consumption upgrading, people's well-being, governance inside China, and global cooperation, promoting China as a leader of global governance of AI. And they say that this is based on an open AI ecosystem, based on equality, mutual trust, diversity, and win-win outcomes. Now, I spent 10 years of my life in China, and so I've had to become a kind of expert in decoding this kind of bland stuff. So diversity is the key word in that. Diversity is a Chinese sort of code for what Confucius called 和而不同, which means harmony but without uniformity, which sounds lovely, but in the Chinese modern-day Communist Party context means not universal values, not Western liberalism, not saying that a democracy is better than a dictatorship. That in the Chinese context, saying that the governance must be diversity is all part of a story about how Russian elections are just as good as Spanish elections, how Chinese human rights are just as good as Swedish human rights. And that is their vision for AI governance. And so, what is China hoping to achieve? Well, they want to have humanoid robots. They have an aging society. They have a particular problem with old farmers because young people have left the villages. If you go into a Chinese village now, it's basically very old people and very small babies, and all of the working age adults are working as migrants in other places. So they're very excited, and understandably, this is totally reasonable. They're very excited in agricultural robots, agricultural drones. They're very excited as fewer and fewer young Chinese people want to work in a factory. They're very proud of things like dark factories, these factories where the lights are never turned on. There are really no lights, and there are no workers, and they work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they have a few technicians there to monitor the factory. And China has a strong belief that as Chinese labor costs go up, and normally everyone expected Chinese factories to move somewhere else, that if they're full of robots and you don't need people to work in them, then China can maintain its dominance of manufacturing, which gives them tremendous power. Now, how does that fit in with that very strict internet governance that we thought was very off-putting? So China has this dual nature governance of AI. Those parts which look at censorship and political control and information that the public sees are every bit as strict as the internet, and very similar to the internet. But those parts that are designed to improve economic efficiency and to help Chinese business are extremely lax and extremely political. So I recommend highly to you, there's a scholar from China, Zhang Huyue, Angela Zhang in the West, who now works at the University of Southern California. She's written this fantastic paper in the Columbia Law Journal that points out this double legal method. So very strict political controls, but very lax, very lenient things like privacy, data protection, and safety. So there's a reason why she says Chinese facial recognition systems are so highly effective. It's because in every city, the government gives enormous amounts of government facial data, public data, to the cameras, to train the cameras. And you see judges taking decisions in Chinese courts that are designed to help economic development. So an example of this would be recently a judge in China granted copyright to an AI-generated image, and said it may be AI generated, but it's copyright. They have the right to have that copyright. The judge was interviewed afterwards. Why did you do that? That's surely going to cause lots and lots of disputes between companies whose images were used to generate this new AI generated image. And he said, well, I was trying to help Chinese economic development so that China can develop AI as fast as possible. There's a very useful phrase that Chinese lawyers use, which is, for small things, we use the law, but for big things, politics. That's how China sees the rule of law. They don't have the rule of law, they have rule by law or law-based governance. And all of those happy phrases from the State Council about win-win outcomes and equality and diversity, you just have to dig a bit into some of the Chinese scholars writing about why AI is important. And you see a slightly darker message, particularly when it's written in Chinese for Chinese audiences. So there's an excellent Substack which follows quite a lot of the top Chinese scholars called Sinification. They had a great piece the other day translating a paper by Professor Di Dongshang of Renmin University in Beijing. And he said, the competition between China and the US over the global market for large language models is essentially a contest for dominance over global political ideology. And he points out that if you ask a chatbot what is good and what is evil, the answer that it gives you shapes your values. And so the country that controls the chatbot, that controls the algorithm, gets to advance its values. And he says this is tremendously important, and that China is in a fight with what he calls the American vision of the dark enlightenment of American tech bosses and the Trump administration, and against what he considers Western liberalism, which would be the European model. And he thinks that this is the model to follow. Now, the final part of this that China thinks is very appealing to other countries is, and I think they may have a point here, that if you take the American atom bomb winner-takes-all version of AI, then that's an America First vision. And what room is there for everyone else? We're waiting for America to win this competition and then to dictate to us. And so only one country gets to win that winner-takes-all race. I have been recently in Singapore. The Prime Minister, I was at a conference, a policy conference, the Singaporean Prime Minister made this point. Singapore is never going to develop the best AI models in the world. It's a clever country, but it's a small country. And so he said, we need to try and get as much advantage from spreading this technology as rapidly as we can. But that's where the value is going to come from. And he made an interesting comparison. He said, at the end of the 19th century, when scientists invented the electric dynamo, it actually took several decades for the electric dynamo to become particularly important in industry. Electrification of industry took a long time. And so being first is great, but it's not the only thing. But actually, those who come second, if they can diffuse it as rapidly and as widely as possible, if they can, like electricity, change the nature of industry, then that's a tremendous prize. And that's where Europe sees an opportunity. Because Europe's view is that this American model, particularly in the times of Trump, is quite alarming and will alarm lots of people. And the Chinese model is also quite alarming. And that the European model is a kind of happy medium. And that diffusion, this term that we hear all the time with AI companies, to spread these technologies as widely as possible, diffusion requires trust. It requires public trust, public acceptance. And so the European dream is that Europe has a plan for people-centered AI that is designed to overcome our fears about jobs, our fears about privacy. It's designed to make sure that trade unions and social partners are involved, that privacy is protected, that safety is paramount, that it's that precautionary model of regulation. And I don't mock in any way that European ambition. I think it's actually politically probably inevitable. I don't think Europe has any choice but to take that approach, given how European societies work. But here's the challenge for Europe in this moment of competition. I think that Europe has every right to pursue autonomy, to try to resist having Trump dictate our values and our ideology. And it has every right to try to find models that are not embedded with the Chinese autocratic ideological vision. So Europe has every right to pursue autonomy, but Europe does not get to choose the price that it pays. When it comes to cost competition, that's going to be set by China, as well as the values competition, because they have the cheapest and the largest number of AI applications, far larger than anything Europe has. And when it comes to performance, the most high performance AI applications or access to capital, well, that's America. America controls that. They have by far the highest performance AI models and by far the largest amounts of capital, 10 times more than Europe can muster at the moment. So yes, Europe has every right to pursue autonomy. I don't think Europe has much political choice, but I worry that Europe's politically sensible strategy is not necessarily economically viable, because we can choose autonomy, but we don't choose the price we pay for autonomy. And we're seeing this now. Earlier this week, it was reported that in Brussels, a plan to fine Google, giant American tech company obviously, for abuses of competition policy has been blocked. It was pushed by the competition commissioner, your very own Teresa Ribera, but it was blocked by the trade commissioner, Maros Sefcovic, because he knew that if Europe fines Google, that Donald Trump will come after Europe. And he said, I don't apologize for defending European interests. And we live in a very rough world, very tough moment. It's true. Maybe Google deserves to be fined. I don't know. I'm not a competition lawyer. But is that worth a trade war? Is that worth losing Donald Trump's support in Ukraine? We don't know. I was recently in Brussels talking to an old friend who's a senior advisor to officials there, and he said, we are out of easy choices. Because Europe is a project of law. How do you bind 27 different countries together? You bind them together with laws and rules that apply equally to everyone. But now you have the Americans saying, if you apply European law, we're going to treat that as an unfair tax on our companies, and we're going to fight you. That's an incredibly difficult dilemma for Europe. My friend in Brussels said, Europe, we shape the world with rules and with money, and we're out of money. And so we're in a norms competition. And that is the attack. And now the attack is on us inside the EU. Not that long ago, European officials talked about the Brussels effect, this amazing effect that Brussels, because of the extraordinary value of the European market, all those people spending all that money, because Europe is one of the most valuable markets in the world, Europe sets these very strict regulations that are very, very focused on protecting consumers, on clean food, on being green, on not having slave labor, all good things. And lots of multinational companies, they grumbled about how strict European regulation was, but they also then eventually used it around the world because it was ultimately easier and more efficient to have one set of rules for all your products around the world. And so they followed the European rules. And this was an extraordinary source of power for a long time. But now, as my friend in Brussels was saying, he said, we used to think we were setting rules for Africa and Central Asia, but now with these American attacks on our regulation of tech, on things like free speech or disinformation from Google or X, we find ourselves on defensive. Can we defend our own ideology, our own values in Europe? And so to end, I think we're going to have to ask some very tough questions about what do our citizens really value? What price are they willing to pay to defend these values? And China has a totally different message, and some of the European papers, they don't match up to the reality of the competition. So I was reading a European Commission white paper on some of the risks embedded in AI, and they gave some examples, and they're real examples. They said, for example, would it not be terrible if an AI application helped employers track the behavior of their workers? Well, in China, that's an industry. That's the point. Or in this European Commission white paper, it said, there is scientific research that there are facial recognition algorithms that are better at recognizing white faces than non-white faces. And this is clearly an example of racial discrimination in facial recognition. Or there are algorithms designed to look at people who have previously committed crimes and to try and identify which of them are likely to commit crimes again. And this European Commission paper said there is evidence that these algorithms are discriminating against foreigners and discriminating against certain races and ethnicities. This is unacceptable racial discrimination. Well, in China, racist algorithms is a business model. The main surveillance companies in China, the ones that make the biggest cameras, the biggest companies that make surveillance cameras, they have filed patents that we have seen, where they say in the patent that one of the features is that these cameras can spot Uyghurs, the Muslim ethnicity that lives in Xinjiang, and that when they see a Uyghur in a crowd, they call the police. Now in China, that's not particularly controversial because that's just a digital version of the human surveillance that happens all the time. I was recently, last year, in the city of Guangzhou in the south of China, checking into the railway hotel because I had a very, very early train the next day. I was going to get 2-3 hours sleep. So very late at night, I check into this little hotel next to the railway station. And there's a middle-aged mother with her teenage daughter also checking into the hotel. And as I'm standing behind them and I hear them speaking Chinese, and I hear from their accent and see from their faces that they're Uyghurs, they're from Xinjiang. And the clerk starts checking them in, then he picks up the phone and calls the police. And then the policeman comes around and starts interrogating this mother and daughter about why they're checking into this hotel. Every time a Uyghur checks into a hotel in China, they call the police. That's the rule. And so putting that into a camera is just part of the business model. So Europe's decision is, how high a price are we willing to pay for a system that works differently to that? And are we absolutely sure that our citizens care enough about our values to pay a price? Because to end, I think one of the great achievements of the European Union, although I'm British, I'm a big believer in the European Union. I freely admit I think Brexit was a disastrous mistake. One of the great things that Europe did was it tackled head-on the challenge of globalization. EU enlargement from the original 6 members brought globalization inside the borders of the European Union. When Spain joined, a fantastic moment. Spain lowered its barriers to trade. It allowed German or French products to come into Spain in return for all those motorways and railways and the modernization of Spain. And it was great for Spain, it was great for Europe. When we allowed the Eastern Europeans in, now a French car company can make big expensive cars in France because they're so profitable that you can afford to make them in France, but little tiny cars, they make them in Slovakia or they make them in Romania because the profit margins are too small to make them in France. So what we did was we brought globalization inside Europe's borders. That was a very smart thing to do. But here's the challenge economically, is that AI is not just globalization in a cheap labor factory in Romania or Slovakia. Globalization is going to come into everything. That if you are a Spanish business in your office in Madrid or in your factory in Murcia, you are going to have competition from China, from America, everywhere, all the time, embedded in everything that we do, because this is the model that is challenging us. And so this is the great challenge we face. And the politics, I think, are very difficult. I don't mock it at all. I think that Europe's ambitions to have a model of governance of AI that is tolerable to European citizens is incredibly important, particularly when mainstream governing parties are under attack from populists. But as I say, we have every right to try and do this the European way, but we don't get to set the cost that we pay. That cost will be set by very, very competitive, in some cases ruthless countries like China and America.
Well, it's a tough act to follow. Yeah. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for, sharing so many insightful ideas with us. And I just wanted to ask you the first question about the future of US-European relations. Clearly, since we cannot have global rules on AI, that would be the logical path, to have at least minimum standards, like the EU when it brought in new member states. Historically, it would make sense to find common terrain between the US and Europe and try somehow to both reap the benefits of this technological revolution, but also make sure that China doesn't get what it wants, or at least that it doesn't spread, it doesn't diffuse this technology through cheap second-best models. The good news about the US is that it's a democracy, and there will be elections, and there will be new leaders in place. So having lived there for many years, and also you still spend quite a bit of time there, what is your assessment, not probably this first year of Trump 2.0, but in the next years of a rapprochement, of a possibility of cooperation, like we had, the Tech and Trade Council that started some years ago and that was making some progress?
Yeah, and so look, I'm conscious that I just ended on quite a pessimistic note. So there are some optimistic kind of possibilities out there. And America and Europe do agree on some fundamental values. And in as much as someone like J.D. Vance, his objection to Europe is that it's coded progressive and Democrat. well, you know, an election could change that, right? That is a very partisan view. So to some extent, Europe's problem right now is, as I say, we've been caught up in the partisan culture wars. And if you want to understand how serious that is, I was talking to a friend of mine who worked for Trump in the first administration about J.D. Vance's speech in Munich in March. And I'm sure many of you remember the shock that speech caused for people in the room in Munich, because he said that, you know, Europe's approach to democracy was essentially a kind of an attack on democracy because, for example, the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, was not invited to the Munich Security Conference, very upset with German laws that say that a party can be banned. Obviously, if you knew more history, I don't know that J.D. Vance does or doesn't know this, but those laws were written by American lawyers in 1945 to stop Nazism ever coming back in Germany. But we're now in a world of kind of post-history. But I asked this friend of mine, I said, he was complaining about our shock. And I said, well, come on. He was essentially telling us how to run our own democracies. At one point, J.D. Vance said, you know, the problem with European democracies is I know they're not democratic, because he gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal immediately after his Munich speech. And he said, what I was saying was, European voters keep telling European governments to have fewer immigrants, and yet they keep letting in immigrants, so they're not democratic. The democracy is not just about institutions, it's about listening to the will of the people. Now, if you're European, I think the will of the people is a phrase that sends a certain chill up your spine, right? We've heard that before. So I said this to my American friend, and I said, you know, what gives you the right to tell us our levels of immigration at a security forum? And he goes, if you want America to provide security for Europe, stop admitting terrorists as immigrants. So essentially, one of our problems is basically it's a very right-wing American government that is in charge at the moment. That will change. That will change. The other optimistic note is that I think there are some areas of AI governance that are so serious that there is at least some hope that even actually America and China can talk about this. So although China has basically resisted talking about, you know, governing things like space warfare or satellite warfare, when I talked to senior American officials at the very end of the Biden administration about the record of US-China relations, they pointed to a couple of achievements. And one of the things they pointed to was the very last meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, which was in November 2024 on the margins of the APEC summit in Lima in Peru. Biden managed to get Xi Jinping to issue a joint agreement that if you're going to launch nuclear weapons, there needs to be a human taking the decision, that an AI algorithm should never decide to launch nuclear weapons. Now, that may sound like a very baby step, but to have China willing to talk about some of these things is potentially a vision of, you know, when we get to really talking about some of the AI safety questions, maybe if you're optimistic, you can achieve the same talks that, say, the Americans and the Soviet Union had after they had terrified themselves with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We actually saw some pretty imaginative, confidence-building mechanisms between the Americans and the Soviet Union, where, remember, you know, at one point in the height of the Cold War, Soviet military officers had the right to inspect American missile bases in America, and Americans could go to the Soviet Union because they understood the dangers of a nuclear war by accident. So maybe there are ways in which we can get to that. And on the European front, I do think that I also don't think that it's entirely about keeping Chinese technology out. I think China makes some great technology that has no political implications at all. You know, if China wants to design an app that means your luggage doesn't get lost when you fly, I mean, great, right? I mean, that's not a problem. So I think we can't fight everything that comes from China, and so we should have kind of white lists or green lists of technologies that don't have security or ideological implications, because China is full of very, very smart engineers doing very, very smart things. But the problem is that there's a total lack of transparency to the way that China does AI algorithms, and that is very, very difficult for Europe to deal with. And there the Americans should be in favor of transparency. That should be an area where at some point, when we can get past this Trumpian moment, we can talk to them about accountability, transparency, labeling of AI-generated content. There are sort of low-hanging fruit that we should be able to get back towards when we stop shouting at each other.
Thank you. So let's open the floor for questions, please. And I will ask you, please, to introduce yourself and to really ask a question and not give a speech, and as a moderator, I will be moderating those who need moderation. Yes, please, at the back.
Am I supposed to say who I am?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm David Allen. I think it's normal that there's some very basic questions about what the United States is and what China is. So I want to ask a China question. You seem to imply, I hope I get this right, that there's some sort of specific ideology in China that's fixed. My experience in China was around 2012, 2013, there was some huge steps backwards in individual freedoms. And that China progressively became more and more authoritarian. Right? I don't know, would you agree with that? And number one, and is that important in any way? Because if we think that the United States government can change, is it possible that we can think that things could change in China?
It's a very good question. So I was a journalist in China twice. I was in China 1998 to 2002, so the head of the Chinese Communist Party at that time was Jiang Zemin. And then in the period that you're talking about, that's the transition between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping. He became Communist Party leader in 2012, then became president in 2013. It is true that Xi Jinping has made some sort of definitive choices. So when I was in China the first time, there was a real debate about, did the Chinese constitution have any power to act as a kind of check and balance on the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government? Could a lawyer go to court on behalf of a citizen or a company and say, according to the Chinese constitution or according to Chinese law, the government has abused its powers? And there were some very senior people who thought that was the right way to go. There was a very lively debate basically about, did China have the rule of law or rule by law? And weirdly, in Chinese, they sound exactly the same. The character's difference, they're both fazhi. Xi Jinping, you are right, took a decision, and he gave a speech in public a few years ago where he said, China is a country with law-based governance, and the Chinese Communist Party is in charge of everything, including the court system, and that judicial independence or the separation of powers are dangerous Western liberal ideas that have no role in China. We will fight them. And there is no doubt that in my time in China, it is much harder to be a Uyghur, much harder to be other forms of ethnic minority. It's much harder for someone like me to interview academics. They're much more frightened. But we should not be romantic about the China that I first went to in 1998 or the China of 1989. They were economically more pragmatic, and the Communist Party was less visible, and ideology was less part of everyday life, but it was a dictatorship. And when I was in China the first time round, if you criticized the Communist Party or if you got on the wrong side of someone powerful, you ended up being locked up and disappearing. So long before Xi Jinping came to power, China had an ideological vision that in fact predates communism. China, some of the Chinese vision of how a society should work goes back to, hundreds of years, even thousands of years of imperial control. This doctrine of legalism, that basically human beings are bad and foolish and wicked and they need to be kept in check with fear, is a doctrine that many Chinese liberal scholars, the same legal scholars arguing back in the day about the rule of law, rule by law, they will say the problem with Xi Jinping is not even that he's a communist ideologue, it's that he's a legalist. These are ideas that go back to some of the very earliest emperors in China. So you're right that China is different, but I would not say that the kind of swing you see in a democratic party, one party losing an election, that kind of shift, it's much more gradual, it's gradations. Now, they're real, but the Chinese Communist Party was always there. It's just more visible now, and it's more willing to kind of show its teeth in public.
Thank you. Sí, por favor.
Talking about being pessimistic or optimistic, I mean, optimistic would be this summer the agreement between Azerbaijan.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm a journalist.
Your name, please?
Angela Rodicio.
Thank you.
To you. So this optimistic thing of this peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that would be saying energy for peace, as the atoms for peace you were saying before, and the pessimistic that everybody is talking now, this war culture, as we have been seeing these days in Beijing, or as also a lot of people talking about the possibility of a new economic recession in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot of. I'm not actually sure that the Azerbaijan Armenia peace agreement is quite as good as it looks, but that's very off subject, so I don't know that I have any particular kind of response in terms of AI governance. But yeah, I don't really have a particularly brilliant response to that.
Here, your left. No. Any other questions?
Excellent session, and today there was an article by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times.
Can you introduce yourself, please, your name?
My name is José Cordeiro, and I work on biological rejuvenation all the way to immortality, and my question is about that in China because of the news yesterday. But today, Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times exactly about this. So it's a fantastic article. You have to read it. China, the USA, and artificial intelligence. But my question is about yesterday, because Xi Jinping said that he plans to live to 150 years.
No, he was talking about how he said to Vladimir Putin on the way up to while meeting veterans that, there are now these kind of technologies that, they say that you can live to 150, but I don't, goodness knows, if Xi Jinping plans to live to 150, then,
okay,
that's another whole world. But I don't, in terms of the AI governance discussion of this evening, I don't really have a particular kind of response on that. On the Thomas Friedman article, I'm glad you raised that, because Thomas Friedman's article, which actually someone asked me about yesterday, essentially says that there are such serious crises coming with things like AI safety that surely America and China will come together and talk. And, it's true that I mentioned the Joe Biden-Xi Jinping meeting where they did agree that you should have a human in the decision chain for launching a nuclear weapon. But there is a problem, which is for now, every time America has tried to have a conversation, this is more true under the Biden administration, they would try to engage the Chinese on things like, we don't have laws of war for some of the new weapons, cyber weapons, biological weapons, or satellite weapons, for example. There's an increasing sense that there's real risks of war in space. The Russians have made some very, very irresponsible proposals about detonating a nuclear device in space that would essentially blast all the communication satellites, because Russia's view is, there'd be Russian satellites that would get zapped, but most of the satellites zapped would be Western, so ha ha ha. The Americans tried to speak to the Chinese to say, look, you're more sensible than that. We should agree that this is a very bad thing. The Chinese just would not engage. And I remember when I was in Beijing speaking to very smart, retired PLA officers and scholars who work on security policy about why is China not willing to engage? You would think that China as a big technological power would want to engage on this. And the answer that I got was, China basically believes that in things like space warfare, or currently in nuclear warfare, it's behind America. And therefore, until it catches up with America and has the same potential to deter, it would not want to enter into that negotiation, because the Chinese worldview is this very bleak worldview that rules and laws have this is the Chinese Communist worldview, have no intrinsic value or power. They are the tools by which the powerful inflict their will on the weak, that might makes right, and therefore if you are not the mighty party in a negotiation, you should not enter that negotiation. So I fear I'm a lot more skeptical than Tom Friedman that China is ready to have that conversation. Now, maybe if China catches up, China is rapidly building nuclear weapons. You mentioned the parade we saw in Beijing on Wednesday with the huge numbers of nuclear weapons that they rolled out. A very clear signal to their own people that China is back. It's part of this propaganda push, but also to the world. China is very rapidly building nuclear weapons. It doesn't have as many nuclear weapons as Russia or America right now, but China basically believes that it will not be taken seriously in this new dangerous world until it has that level of, it has some sort of parity. Now, if you're an optimist, once China feels more confident, then it may be ready to talk about rules. And then maybe there's a parallel with AI. But we need to understand that the Chinese Communist Party thinks of rules and governance and laws as instruments by which the powerful exert their influence. They're not intrinsic they have no intrinsic merit in themselves or worth in themselves or value in themselves. And they certainly don't believe that anyone powerful is held to account by those laws. And of course, the tragedy that we in Europe face is that America has now elected a president who seems to have a fairly similar view of what laws are for. So this is a very dangerous moment. Thank you.
I was actually asking also not only China, but to bring in Russia, because Vladimir Putin said that whoever controls AI will rule the world. And yesterday, when Xi Jinping said that we might live to 150, Putin said we can become immortal. So what I'm saying is that we should also include Russia both on AI and biotechnology.
Yeah, and look, Russia, I mean, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that Russia and China are very different countries. They're both revisionist powers, but Russia is essentially willing, for example, to play at the United Nations in governance forums. Russia is now playing Wrecker. Russia is willing to veto things like there was an expert committee at the United Nations which was designed to spot whether North Korea was building nuclear weapons. Russia vetoed that committee being renewed, and so now the UN has less ability to know what is going into the North Korean nuclear program. China abstained because China has a different incentive. China is very upset with some aspects, many aspects of the post-1945 order, but China is not a wrecker in the same way that Russia is. Russia basically now at the United Nations, when I was there in New York recently talking to ambassadors, Russia is willing to lift arms embargoes when there are civil wars in very disrupted countries in Africa, because Russia's view is just whatever makes the West uncomfortable, whatever makes the world more chaotic is good for Russia. China is not that country. China does have an interest in governance, it has an interest in global trade laws, but it does not want governance that allows the West to criticize China, to suggest that China is in any way has less good human rights or a less good political system than a Western liberal democracy. And so it is very, very keen to advance alternative narratives about China's form of governance, that China's form of autocratic governance is superior because it delivers better performance and better results than the kind of the slow, sclerotic, chaotic Western democratic model. And that is absolutely true in AI governance as well, that this is a push for performance legitimacy.
Thank you. Over there.
Thank you very much. Marjorie Pion, researcher. I understand that the technology of AI is growing not linearly but exponentially. So do you think there is room for autonomy in Europe, or it's already too late?
So it's, I mean, the end of this story is not written. And Europe does have some very big companies with a lot of data, and there is a kind of optimistic view that if Europe can apply that data in interesting ways, there are very big European car companies. Airbus is a very big European company. They have a lot of data. If they can develop AI models that use that data well, there's no reason why Europe should not. When I talk to Chinese AI researchers about how they see Europe, they see a couple of very large problems that Europe, to their view, has. One is expensive energy and electricity. So industrial electricity in the European Union on average is about twice as expensive as electricity in America, and about 1.5 times as expensive as in China. And that's a real problem for these incredibly energy intensive sort of technologies. And you also need stable electricity. And so the Chinese believe that because they've rolled out this extraordinary amount of generation as they electrify their entire economy, not just renewable energy, more renewable energy being rolled out than any other country on Earth, but also more coal for the moment than any other country on Earth. Just incredible amounts of electrification going on in China. The Americans, I think, would take the same view. J.D. Vance, again, in his February speech in Paris to that AI summit, said, why is Europe rejecting some very reliable forms of energy, which he means fossil fuels, when we know that we need unlimited energy for AI development? So I think the Chinese and the Americans would both say that Europe is not serious until the American view should just burn lots of coal and oil and gas. The other thing that Chinese say about Europe is that Europe's very high labor costs, Europe's regulation, Europe's immigration rules even. I've heard that cited, that if you want to attract the world's top talent, Europe's immigration policies, certainly my own country, Britain's immigration policies don't look very smart. And so China, I think, thinks it has the scale, and it has the engineers, it has the cheap energy, and it has also Chinese capitalism is this just extraordinarily brutal competitive model. The profit margins for Chinese companies are incredibly small. So very, very tough to do business. It's a kind of Darwinian sort of fight to the death every day for Chinese businesses. And that gives you an absolutely extraordinary incentive to try to lower costs all the time. That's the kind of the daily reality of Chinese business, is cost cutting all the time, because you're in this constant price competition. Europe just isn't in that same world. There's a lot of incumbents in Europe controlling quite important industries who don't face that same competition, or who have not faced that sort of competition. So whether they're right or not, I have not met any Chinese expert on AI who takes Europe seriously as a competitor. They think that we are something between very disadvantaged and irrelevant.
Javier.
Hi, I'm Rafael Garcia Meiro. I'm the CEO of AENOR, which is the standardization and certification body in Spain. And when you talk about the extremes, China being very efficient in developing technology, and also America or States being very powerful in performance, seems to be like there's something in the middle for Europe, which in my understanding is not in the development in the technology, in the usage of the technology. Governance is not about development of technology. For example, using gender is something that the large language models or any engine is using as part of the technology, and it's not good or bad. It's bad if you use for being able to human resources selecting people in the market. But it's good if you are using it for cancer development, because maybe there are some different things biased in gender. So it's about governance, it's about usage, and that is still not done in anywhere in the world. Maybe you are saying, yes, in China there are some use cases, for example, biometrical and so on. The thing is, are we going to use it? And I understand you're saying we still have that in our future, that we have to decide, and we have at least faith that we are not going to do it. And Europe has been leading values in many different places in the history. Do you agree with these two layers?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two very important points you're making, and they're both good ones. So I think, Europe, logically, if the two extreme models look unattractive, then it's like kind of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? Surely Europe can be the perfect porridge that is just the right sweetness in the middle. Because, as I say, diffusion in a democratic society, and that's not just Europe, that's every democracy, diffusion requires trust. And I think a lot of people in general publics in lots of countries are very worried about the implications for jobs, the implications for safety, the worries about discrimination. So if Europe can come up with smart ways of addressing trust, embedding that trust, then that should be an opportunity. I guess the thing that strikes me, and I'm not an expert on who's going to win the technological race, but the thing that strikes me is that when I talk to AI experts from America and from China, they talk about performance and access to capital and scale and speed. And there, I think Europe does have a problem. That we have these pockets of excellence, we have some brilliant engineers, some brilliant companies, some brilliant universities, but it's in this kind of race to be the first to dominate these technologies, because if you're in a standard setting institution, you know the extraordinary power that comes with setting the standards. And China understood this 20 years ago when I was first in China. China every year realized that it was paying astonishing amounts of money every year to Western companies that controlled the standard for the device that picks up electricity for a high-speed train that takes that electricity from the cable. And that standard was set by a Western company. And then when China started building high-speed trains, they had to use the European standard, they had to pay licensing fees for software, for the standards, for trains, for televisions, for medicine, and they realized how much they were paying every year. And the Chinese Communist Party, entirely reasonably, China has every right to want to develop, set out plans to say setting standards is an unbelievable source of power and an unbelievable source of revenue, and we need to make sure that everything we do externally has standards embedded in it. So to give you a single example, high-speed trains, when China, with the Belt and Road project, lends money to a country like Nepal next door to build a railway, that comes with Chinese standards. It's a Chinese train, it has Chinese standards. And what does that mean? It means that forever, when Nepal needs to repair those trains, if Nepal wants to build new trains, if Nepal wants to have larger train lines, it has to pay royalties to China because the standards are Chinese standards. And so China is entirely understandably bent on trying to set standards, and now in AI. And I should say, I lived in China for 10 years. I do not want to live in the world that the Chinese Communist Party imagines to be the perfect world. But I want Chinese people to have a chance of development. I love the country of China. And I used to have lots of conversations with Chinese officials about, there's this kind of straw man argument they use. Are you saying we don't have the right to try and rise and become rich and modern? And I'd say, no, you have every right to rise and become modern and to work hard and to have engineers. But I am a Western liberal Democrat. And so if your success is not liberal, is illiberal, then I think you have the right to compete, but I want you to lose that competition. But I also understand that that means we have to compete on our side. There's nothing about the 21st century that says that European democracies or the American democracy get to stand on a pedestal and say, we are just always the winners of this moral competition. We have to compete. If we believe in our values, and I do absolutely believe in our values, and European society, I think, is a fantastic, a fantastic historic achievement in many ways. But if we're not competitive, if we're not sustainable, if we don't know how to compete with this cheaper model that is coming from China or this more high performance model from America, no one is going to kind of give us the right of veto. We're now in a world where globalization is in all of our lives all the time, and we have to compete. And that is a really hard conversation that our governments need to have with our people. What do we value? How competitive are we willing to be? What are we willing to do to be more competitive? What values may be more important than others? And these are very, very serious conversations that we need to have, and I don't think we have a lot of time.
These are the type of conversations that we want to foster in Aspen Institute. So, thank you. More questions, please.
Hi, my name is Harry. I'm a British civil servant, and actually last week I just completed a master's on British government's approach to AI. And I was wondering, when you talk about the European approach, are you including the British government explicitly in that, or is it a separate thing? And how do you think the wider UK-EU relationship will manifest in this sort of geopolitical competition about AI?
So my understanding is that the UK approach, which should not surprise us, is quite European, but is a little bit more in the middle of the Atlantic than the full European approach. It's, closer to Europe than America, but it's sort of halfway. I don't think that should surprise us. That's true in lots of areas. And I think in many ways, there's probably something to recommend that approach. But I do think that Britain has a scale problem, that it's very difficult. There is a belief, I don't know if this is true or not, but there are AI experts who believe that you cannot be the source of governance if you don't have the technologies, if you don't have the tech firms, if you don't have the scale, if you don't have the capital. And just the UK is, I think, probably too small to really be able to influence the governance in a big way. And we see this, so a classic example, now it's not exactly AI, but those same discussions that Europe is having at the moment about how we regulate big American tech companies. The same American tech companies have problems with some of the digital taxes that the British government is planning, and we can see the British government is giving a higher priority to having a good relationship with America than they are to some of the original plans to have digital taxes on tech companies, because everything is about trade-offs. And we live in a world where you have to choose. Do you want to have a trade war with America? Do you want to have American help in Ukraine? Britain's nuclear deterrent depends on America. These are all in the mix, right? And so I'm not sure that Britain has a kind of decisive role to play. How does that play into the relationship with Europe? I don't know. I mean, I think that generally there's an interesting, you're a British civil servant, you probably can't say in public, but it seems to me that at the moment the British government is not very brave about its relationship with Europe. So when things are not visible to the British public, there's actually quite a lot going on. But if it becomes visible to the British public, then it gets very difficult. And anything that looks like a debate about immigration becomes very difficult. But maybe on AI governance, there's things that can be done. I worry about the British approach to China is, so Britain has this strategy. There's a UK-China strategy, which is basically, the short version is, we want to be more open to Chinese investments than the Europeans are. So, for example, the European Union has put a tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Britain has not. And so that's basically Britain sort of saying to the Chinese, bring your BYD factories and open them in Britain. So the British approach is we want to be more open to investment than the Europeans are, but Britain is going to criticize human rights in Hong Kong or criticize human rights in Tibet. Britain is going to sort of say things about China destabilizing Taiwan. And so this is called a strategy by the British government. The problem is it's not a strategy, it's a description of the relationship that Britain would like to have with China. Because it would be nice to have lots of Chinese investments, but to be able to say to China, we don't approve of what you're doing in Hong Kong. The problem is that when China hears this from the British government, China's response is no. At which point we don't actually have a strategy, because it's not a strategy, it's a wish. And a wish is not the same as a strategy. So I fear this is an intra-British conversation now about how rubbish Britain is right now. But I'm not sure that I would pin my hopes on the UK. But good luck when you go back to your job.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luis Perez. I am a biologist that has worked mainly in marketing. Let me go somehow skeptical about AI. It is not going to increase productivity. It's just going to increase spam and noise and it is not going to be a qualitative change, just quantitative, and very probably very good to increase the capital in the same hands or something like that. What is your reaction about this?
This criticism.
Yeah, it's a reasonable argument. So I'm not an AI kind of fantasist. So in my own field of journalism, I'm quite worried by what AI is going to do, and I'm not particularly a fan of the idea of new media content produced by chatbots, partly because that's going to put me out of a job. So I'm not objective about this, but also I think there's problems with this. My understanding, and I'm not an expert on biology at all, my understanding is that there are legitimate reasons to believe that we already do studies which look at every study ever conducted on a given disease and see if they can find patterns where if you look at all of the clinical trials for a drug and you put them all together, maybe you can spot something that the clinical trial wasn't even looking for. And that, in the pre-AI world, has discovered some amazing things. So we have found use cases for drugs that were not actually being looked for in those clinical trials. When you start doing massive surveys of every clinical trial ever conducted, I think it sounds logical to me, as a non-expert, that AI offers you the ability to do that just exponentially, at exponentially greater scale. And so if that realizes that there are drugs that have use cases that we weren't looking for, if that helps us improve the quality of radiography so that there are ways of identifying tumors that are hard for the naked eye, it seems to me perfectly plausible that that could be a valuable use. And I think, we know that data analysis is already a valuable tool when it's done by people. If we can speed it up, if we can make it cheaper, then I don't think it's irrational to think that that could improve productivity in lots of ways. But I'm not a kind of, the idea that AI is going to kind of change everything, for sure. I certainly think that some of the claims made by some of the AI companies, are probably partly because they need to attract an enormous amount of capital right now, and some of these models will not have the life-changing effects that we say they will. But if AI is basically about just vastly increasing the amount of quantitative data analysis that can be done, then that's, we've already seen tremendous things come out of manual human quantitative analysis. And so I think if you can speed it up and automate that, I don't see why that shouldn't have some fairly impressive results. But it's not magic. It doesn't replace science. It doesn't replace scientists. It doesn't replace the human element. But I think if you can harness it together, it seems logical to me that it will have fairly impressive effects.
Thank you. There in the back.
Hi, Aurora Minguez is my name. I'm also a journalist, and I wanted to ask you about how do you use artificial intelligence in your work? how do you use it in your media, in The Economist? Have you experienced one article completely written by artificial intelligence? And is there any kind of future for normal journalists while in 2 years' time artificial intelligence is going to dominate completely our lives? Thanks very much.
That's a very good question. So The Economist is spending a lot of time thinking about AI. We have some smart journalists who are now basically their whole job is to think about how AI could work. But we're extremely cautious about AI because The Economist, our entire business model is based on being trusted, on trying to be accurate, on trying to be authoritative. And so there are no AI written articles in The Economist. What we are experimenting, for example, there is now on our website, you can click on something that says, would you like an AI summary of this long article, so that you can decide whether you want to read the whole article. But it's labeled as, this is an AI summary, click on this, you'll get an AI summary. We have, for example, short videos explaining, what just happened at the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. Those are done by our journalists in America or our defense editor. Those short videos, you can now click on something that says, would you like to watch this video in French or in Spanish? And it says very visibly, this is an AI translation of this journalist's words. So we're extremely careful about labeling. And what we're trying to do is to add value without destroying the credibility that is absolutely the most important thing to us. In my own work, I admit I'm quite skeptical, and I do not use AI models, for example, to check my work, whether it's sort of good writing. I mean, I think, frankly, I should be fired if I needed to do that. I've been a journalist for a long time now. But I could imagine that if you use AI, for example, as a kind of turbocharged search engine, that could be quite interesting. So I could imagine, if I went to Indonesia to do a story about climate change debates in Indonesia, I don't speak the local language. Would it be a useful exercise to say to an AI bot, who are the most respected, the most cited Indonesian climate scientists? What are the most important papers they've written in the last 5 years? Could you find them, translate them into English and send them to me? I think that could be a really interesting thing to do. But for me, that's like a kind of super Google rather than trying to help me write an article. I think if I needed to write an article, I should be fired is my view. But I'm an old grumpy guy. And my colleague Mike, I think, may agree. He's the Economist Spain, chief Spain correspondent. Fantastic. Brilliant man. So I hope Mike agrees with me.
Michael, do you want to add anything or ask a question?
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. I was intrigued by something you said towards the end of your talk, and which you repeated just now, that you think that AI is somehow intensifying globalization, because many people would say we're in a world in which globalization is retreating under the forces of mercantilism and protectionism, and that there are similarities between MAGA and the dual circulation economy in China, for example. And what you just said about standards in China, China exporting standards, makes one think that we may be moving toward a world of walled gardens, as it were, to use a term common in the internet, and that AI might end up a bit like that as well.
So you're definitely right that so for example, that academic that I mentioned, Di Dongshang from Renmin University, who says that the great virtue of having control of the algorithm is you control the ideology. Something else he has written is that China can preserve its dominance of manufacturing with these dark factories with no workers. And there's a good economist, was at Peking University now in Shanghai, Yao Yang, who says, when Western journalists like us say that China is getting old before it gets rich, that the demographic challenge for China is impossible, he says, no, you're wrong, because as the population shrinks, the robots will rise up beautifully to meet them in the middle, and China will be fine. So that's very much a sort of China remaining the center of dominating world manufacturing, which does fit your model of a walled garden. The counterpart of that, I think, is that China's economy on its own, partly because they don't have as much consumer demand as we would like them to have, because they have this mercantilist export-driven model. China needs markets outside. They're making far too much stuff to only sell it inside China. And so they do need globalization to continue. And I was at the same conference I was at in Singapore recently, where the Prime Minister talked about the electric dynamo being a technology that took decades to become really widespread. The head of the former head of the Singapore Central Bank, who's now their climate envoy, he said something really smart, I think, which was, globalization is not the same thing as the governing bodies of globalization. So the World Trade Organization is definitely in real trouble, clearly. But globalization, if it means global trade, is organic. It doesn't depend on institutions. And his idea is that global trade is like water. It will find a way to flow. And so we should avoid a binary model where the old globalization dies and is replaced by deglobalization. That he thinks, and I think he's probably right, that the future is going to be more fragmented, less efficient, less fair in some ways. If you're Singapore, you believe that by working hard, becoming competitive, being the perfect student, you could attract investment. They're now very upset by a world in which they see in Southeast Asia, the governments of Southeast Asia have very different tariff rates slapped on them by Donald Trump. And what are they doing? They're competing among themselves to take advantage of these different tariff rates, which have no real logic to them based on who Donald Trump likes or dislikes. That is not a world that countries like Singapore would like to live in. But it's a kind of, to use the technical term, it's a crappier version of globalization. It's a less fair, less rational, less efficient version of globalization, but I think it probably is still a version of globalization. And so I think that that argument in the European context that we're going to be facing global competition, I don't think that's going away. I think that remains a really serious challenge for Europe and for everyone, that price competition is coming, and we can't just wish it away.
David, thank you so much. I know we could go on and on for hours. This is such an amazing, broad topic and so meaningful to all of us. But I want to make sure that you come back to Aspen and to Fundación Telefónica at some point, so we don't want to exhaust you. Thank you so much, everyone, and we look forward to the next session of Tech&Society in a few weeks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. Gracias.